The AAA security architecture is a framework that allows administrators to control user access to network devices by using three independent security functions. These functions are authentication, authorization, and accounting. Authentication is the process where a user must prove their identity. This is typically achieved with a username and password combination. So for example, if a user is attempting to connect to a router's console port, they might be prompted for their authentication credentials. Authorization is the process that determines which resources or operations a user is able to access, and it does that through certain access privileges or restrictions. Just because a user is authenticated correctly doesn't mean that they're authorized to do anything they want. So if you log in with working credentials and you're successfully authenticated as a valid network user, you might still be restricted in the actions you're allowed to take based on the authorization guidelines. And accounting is used to record all of the actions a user takes while they are accessing network resources. That does that by recording and storing log files. So this can track items such as the times a user was connected, which commands they executed, and much more. AAA can be achieved using either an external server or locally on our device. When using an external server, the two most popular protocols are Radius and TACACS+. Radius is an IETF open standard that uses UDP communication on ports 1812 and 1813 by default. Radius does only encrypt the password field. Also notable is that Radius combines the authentication and authorization processes. Radius is primarily used where we want to restrict network access. TACACS+, on the other hand, is a Cisco proprietary protocol that uses reliable TCP communication over port 49 by default. Where Radius only encrypts the password field, TACACS+ can encrypt the entire payload. Also, as opposed to Radius, TACACS+ does not combine any of the AAA processes, so authentication, authorization, and accounting are all separate. This protocol is preferred for usage with secure device administration. Now, the recommended solution for mid to large environments that is able to handle both Radius secure network access and TACACS+ device administration, that's Cisco's ICE, their Identity Services Engine. So configuring external AAA with something like Cisco ICE, that requires two steps. First, it requires the configuration of our router, and it requires the configuration of the AAA server itself, which might be something like the Cisco ICE. Now, configuring Cisco ICE in this manner, that's actually outside of the scope of this exam, so we're going to focus on the local configuration here. We're going to configure AAA to operate without TACACS+. We're going to configure AAA to operate as if there is a TACACS+ server in our environment, but we're also going to implement local mode as a fallback method, meaning that the router will handle authentication and authorization by using the local user database found on the router. So let's connect to a router now and take a look at how we can configure this. So here we're connected to our router, and you can see that right now, if I hit return, I'm allowed to connect with no prompt for credentials at all. So when we do enable AAA, that's going to add some authentication here to our login process. And the first thing we want to do, let's go into enable mode. We'll go under global configuration mode as well. And the first thing we want to do is enable the AAA service globally on the router. We can do that under global configuration mode with the command AAA new-model. If I hit enter, that's all it takes to enable AAA globally on there. And now I want to show you how to point to an external TACACS+ server, such as a Cisco ICE, while we still use local AAA as our fallback method. Now, since we don't have an external AAA server configured, in our case, our router is going to try to reach out to that server. It's going to see that it's unreachable, and then it's going to try a backup method that we configure. So it's important that we configure this locally so that it works correctly. So the next thing we want to do, if we're going to do that, is we want to create a local user. We can do that with the command username. I'll say Charles, and I'm also going to give this user the highest privilege of 15, and then I'll say secret Cisco, and I'll hit enter. So now we have a local user in our user database that we can use for a fallback method. So with that in place, we now want to add a TACACS Plus server to our configuration. Now, depending on your iOS version, the commands are going to vary slightly. If you're running a version prior to iOS 15.x, the command will be TACACS-server host, followed by the host name or IP address of the TACACS Plus server. Now, if I hit enter there, you can see it doesn't really like that command. And that's because I'm in a newer version of that. I'm running iOS 15.7. So in the newer iOS version, the relevant command is TACACS Plus server, followed by the name of the server. So this is going to allow you to give that server an easily identifiable name that's going to help you when you're looking through your running configuration later. I'm going to name this instance just something really simple. I'm just going to call it TACACS, and I'm going to hit enter. And now you can see we're under TACACS configuration mode. So now we can point to the actual server by either its host name or by the IP address. I'm going to use the IP address, so I'm going to say address. And if we look at contextual help, you'll see that we can use either an IP version 4 or an IP version 6 address. I'm going to use the IP version 4 address, and I'm going to say 10.1.1.5 for that address. And I'm going to hit enter to accept that. And finally, we need to enter our TACACS Plus key here by using the command key followed by the actual key string. Now, this is actually the pre-shared key that we have to configure, which would already be configured on the AAA server itself so that this router could authenticate to that server. And I'm going to use the key security here. I'm going to hit enter to accept that. Going to back out into global configuration mode. And one other thing that we want to do is we want to create a server group. So if you have a really large environment, it's entirely possible that you have multiple TACACS Plus servers, or you could have a TACACS Plus and a Radius server, or maybe you have redundant servers in place just to ensure that you have reachability in case of a server failure. And what we can do is we can leverage server groups to set up those fallback methods. Now, when we create this group, the order in which we add the servers later, that's going to determine which order they'll be used during failover. So it will go right down the list and try those in order. And the command to do this is AAA group server. And notice if we use contextual help, we have several options at our disposal. We have diameter, LDAP, radius, and TACACS Plus. In our case, we are creating a TACACS Plus server group. So we'll use that keyword, and then we need to give this group a name for identification. I'm going to call that T-group, just make a really simple name, and I'll hit enter. So now we are under the server group configuration mode, and we can begin to add our servers to this group in the order that we want them to be used for failover. Now, since I've only configured a single TACACS Plus server, this is a bit redundant to create a server group, but I wanted to give you a look at how you could actually do that and how that configuration works. Now we're under server group configuration mode, and we can say server name, and the name of the server that we previously configured was TACACS. So we want to call out that name. Very, very simple. If we had more servers, we could re-enter that command for each server that we wanted to add into this group. Now let's back out into global configuration mode, and we now want to enable AAA login authentication. And the command we want to use is AAA authentication login. And if we look at our contextual help options, you'll see that we have a couple of options here. What we're doing is we're actually defining what's called a method list. And the method list is going to indicate the authentication methods that can be applied to a line or to an interface. So you see that we can create a custom list if we want to. We can give that a name, or we can use the default list. Now, in most cases, we'll just choose the default method list. So that's what I'm going to choose here. And if we again look at contextual help, you can see there's an option for group under there. And since we have defined a server group, we want to use the group keyword followed by the name of the group, which was T-group. And if we use contextual help once more, notice that we have the exact same options presented to us. And that's because this is allowing us to configure additional authentication methods. So as it stands, we have one authentication method that we've listed here, which is our TACACS Plus server group. We can add additional TACACS Plus server groups if we'd like to. We could add a Radius server group and so on. We can see all of those options there. The option that I want to choose is local, because that's going to fall back to our local user database when the connection to our TACACS Plus server fails. And again, remember, I don't actually have a TACACS Plus server in this lab, so this is necessary for the configuration to work properly. So we have the keyword local, and one other thing that we can do here if we wanted to is we could actually append the keyword enable as our final method. And what that's going to do is that's going to use the configured enable password as the last resort for getting logged in if everything else fails. So I'll go ahead and hit enter with that. And that completes AAA authentication. Now we want to configure authorization. What I want to do here is I want to enable the authorization requirement for starting an exec shell. So if any user tries to do that, they're going to be prompted for authorization credentials. And that command is AAA authorization exec. If we look at our options, again, we can create a list or we can use the default list. I'm going to use that default method list again, as we typically do. And again, contextual help is going to show the option for group. So I want to use the group keyword. And again, I want to enter that group name, which is T-group. That is our TACACS Plus server group. And then we want to also add, again, that local fallback option and hit enter. Now we've configured AAA authentication and authorization. We've done that to an external TACACS Plus server, which we don't actually have, but we've also configured local login as our fallback method. So we can actually test this very simply. We can log out of the console. I'll hit enter to log back in. And you can see that this time, instead of allowing us to go right into the console, we're prompted for a username. So I'll input Charles. The password that I configured was Cisco. And now it does let me into the console as you would expect. So that's a look at how we can configure external AAA servers and server groups and use local AAA as a fallback method for both authentication and authorization.